Hi everyone, this is Kyle, and I'm doing a second video regarding Lord of the Rings and a recent resurfaced Ian McKellen interview where he says his job as an actor is not to presume to tell the audience what to think ever in anything I do, and how it's kind of in stark contrast to how Hollywood approaches stories today. And the reason why I'm doing a second video, I call this a part 2 if you want, is because I'm going into Lord of the Rings here and Amazon and what they did with Tolkien's work, and honestly, there was so much that happened there that you simply can't put it all into a single 15-minute video. Now, in the last video I made, I talked about Ian McKellen, and essentially he's saying he's really just there to portray whatever character he's assigned to portray. He's not there to tell the audience what to think. He just works on behalf of the author who has the message. Yeah, I'm paraphrasing. I went into Peter Jackson. He gave one interview where he stated, and again I'm paraphrasing, that the people working on Lord of the Rings, they didn't want to put any of their messages into Lord of the Rings, but rather they wanted to honor Tolkien by putting his messages into the movies. And then you contrast that with Amazon, where Lindsay Weber, she's saying it felt only natural that Tolkien's work would reflect what the world actually looks like, or the world Tolkien created would reflect what the world actually looks like, which Tolkien's world, our Middle-earth, is a made-up fantasy world, and fantasy by its very definition does not reflect the real world, so that statement makes no sense. And how Amazon, they do have their hiring or their diversity quotas, and they're injecting a lot of diversity into Lord of the Rings, which is based on European mythology and European folklore. And it's a story that Tolkien intended as a mythology for Britain, and Lord of the Rings fans said, look, there are some stories out there where being diverse doesn't always make sense. Yeah, Lord of the Rings is one of them. Just like how in Disney's remake of Aladdin, it wouldn't make sense to cast white people in what is originally a Middle Eastern folktale. If you were to make a story based on, I don't know, Japanese fairy tales, logically the people in there, if you ask me, would be Japanese, and so on. And then the reaction to that was predictable. Lord of the Rings fans, they got called certain istophobe words. I'm going to go just a little more into that, and I'm going to go into a few other things that the people at Amazon were doing and what the people working on the show did to change Tolkien's work. Now, probably the single biggest change they made story-wise would be the character of Galadriel, which, this right here, this is Galadriel in the Peter Jackson Lord of the Rings movies, which, she's pretty accurate to the books. She is very powerful. She has one of the 3 elven rings, but people would describe her as being very feminine, and I think she's been kind of likened to the Virgin Mary. Well, in today's modern age, there are certain rules that you have to follow when you're depicting female characters, which are essentially that every female character needs to be a quote-unquote a strong female girl boss. She needs to be fierce. She needs to be a warrior. She needs to never ever need a man's help with anything. She needs to be better than men at everything. She needs to be smarter and all, stuff like that. So here is the modern Galadriel, which yeah, she's a warrior now, essentially, which that is not what Galadriel was in Tolkien's works at all. But now she is a strong woman, girl boss queen, and so now she is an acceptable character by modern writing standards. And yeah, fans, people who watch The Rings of Power, they hated the Galadriel that they had in here. She was very unlikable. She's been described by many as insufferable, and she was nowhere close to accurate to the way Tolkien wrote her at all, other than she has the same name. Now, and a funny thing here, I'm on Lord of the Rings Wiki, or Lord of the Rings fandom wiki, and I have Galadriel's page here brought up, and it's kind of funny. They have a disclaimer here for her portrayal in the Rings of Power show, and it says, an alternate version of Galadriel is the most central character of Amazon Studios' series of Lord of the Rings of Power, portrayed by Emily Child Villiers as a child and Morfydd Clark as an adult. This version of Galadriel deviates considerably from her character as described by J.R.R. Tolkien in The Lord of the Rings and The Silmarillion. So it is kind of funny. They're admitting that this is not accurate Galadriel at all. And then down here under Sundering Seas in Numenor, it says, the following plotline involving Numenor was invented for the series. There is no mention of Galadriel ever visiting the Island Kingdom in any capacity in any of Tolkien's writings. Yeah, Galadriel never went to Numenor. And the showrunners were asked about this at one point, about Galadriel having never actually visited Numenor. So I remember the answer that one of them had was, where does Tolkien state that Galadriel never went to Numenor? Are you kidding me? So essentially, if Tolkien does not state this explicitly that something does not happen, then we have license to do it. For example, Tolkien never stated that there are no immigration allegories in his work, so I guess Amazon here thinks that they have license to put that in. With this one guy here saying that that elf workers are taking your trades. Now, what did Tolkien himself think of allegories? Well, let's have a quick look here. We have this one quote from Tolkien. I cordially dislike allegory in all its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. I much prefer history, true or feigned, with its varied applicability to the thought and experience of the readers. I think that many confuse applicability with allegory, but the one resides in the freedom of the reader and the other in the purpose domination of the author. So yeah, Tolkien was not a fan of allegories at all. He preferred applicability. Now, the difference here is he states, freedom of the reader or domination of the author. With allegory, it's domination of the author, where the author is actively telling you what you should think, whereas freedom of the reader, it means the author will present you something, and then the reader, you can judge the issue for yourself. But back to this here. I mean, Tolkien did not have immigration allegories and stuff in his works. I mean, why is this in here? And what was some of the other cast members' approach to things like this? Well, here we have Rings of Power star Nazanin Boniadi channels Iranian activism in her character. These brave women inspired me to play the role. Bronwyn was a made-up character. So they're putting activism into a fantasy story. Tolkien fans know they do not want that sort of stuff in Lord of the Rings adaptations, because that stuff is not a part of Lord of the Rings. You also have this right here, which is a completely made-up story about how Mordor came to be. I'm not going to play this entire video, I'm just going to skip ahead, but I'm going to show you exactly what happened. Okay, let's take a look at what Amazon did here. I'm going to be skipping ahead a little bit here. I'm not going to play the entire video, but puts a sword into some kind of hole, opens up a dam, water is flowing down. And then the water's all flowing somewhere here. Okay, I'll skip ahead again. And it all flows toward the volcano here. And that sets the volcano off, and that right there, that is how Mordor came to be, according to Amazon. I mean, what in God's name is this? Now let's look up how Mordor actually came to be. Alright, now I got this one article here from Bonding into Comics. I'm starting it right in the middle here. So I'm starting right here where it says, however, this is Amazon, how Amazon did Mordor's origin. Bonding into Comics, they say, however, this is not how Mordor came about at all. In fact, the land was not idyllic or bucolic like in Switzerland. It had repeatedly been hammered by eruptions of Mount Doom over the year, and thus was a desolate land that readers and viewers of Lord of the Rings know. And then we have a couple of things said by Christopher Tolkien and John Ronald Reuel Tolkien here. In Peoples of Middle-earth, Christopher Tolkien writes in the notes section of the book that the name Mordor was already an Elvish name for that region, maybe already an Elvish name for that region, because of its volcano Orodruin and its eruptions, which were not made by Sauron but were a relic of the devastating works of Melkor in the long First Age. In the Silmarillion, Tolkien details that Sauron made Mordor his home because of the volcano. He wrote, "There above the valley of Gorgoroth was built his fortress vast and strong, Barad-dûr, the Dark Tower, and there was a fiery mountain in the land that the elves named Orodruin. Indeed, for that reason Sauron had set there his dwelling long before, for he used the fire that welled there from the heart of the earth in his sorceries and in his forging. In the midst of the land of Mordor he fashioned the ruling ring." So in other words, Mordor was already like that. It was not some lush land and then turned into Mordor because somebody stuck a sword into a hole that released a dam that led water to flow into a mountain causing a volcano eruption, like what Amazon did. That's not what happened. I mean, Mordor was really a remnant of Morgoth from the first stage, after he was overthrown at his rule at Angband. Morgoth originally being Melkor before he stole the Silmarils from Feanor, and then Feanor began to call him Morgoth, and Melkor and now Morgoth escaped over the Middle Earth. But yeah, Mordor had a volcano erupting there for a while. Mount Doom was erupting for a while. It did not come about the way that Amazon portrayed it at all. And Amazon also had this origin story of how Mithril came to be, which was an elf was fighting a Balrog, and what was it, lightning struck? There was a lightning strike or something like that, and it struck into the earth or whatever, and that was how Mithril came to be? No. Okay, and another change they made was they made up this one character, Adar, in Lord of the Rings. And again, I'm on LordofTheRingsWiki.com or LOTRFandom.com/wiki. And I like how there's a disclaimer up here. It says non-canon alert. The subject of this article originates from non-canonical sources. To learn about what is considered canon, see LOTR canon. Because yeah, this is a completely made-up character. Some guy that loves orcs, and essentially his sole purpose is to bring in this morally gray trend that you're seeing being implemented in so many stories now, modern stories. But I mean, here's a problem with that. I mean, Lord of the Rings is not a morally gray story by any stretch of the imagination. It is a black and white, good and evil type of story. And Lord of the Rings became a huge story, a hugely popular story, as a black and white, good and evil type of story, rather than a morally gray story. I mean, the insertion of this character here is essentially just Amazon injecting modern trends into a timeless story, or into a timeless world. I mean, this character does not fit in Middle-earth at all. And then you also have the Númenóreans, which the Númenóreans were powerful. They were warriors. Well, how did they get portrayed in Rings of Power? Kind of like adolescents, essentially. They had people in there who were Númenóreans. They didn't look like warriors at all. And then you have Elendil here. How did they portray Elendil, who's, a king, a warrior? How did they portray him? Well, let's look. I mean, he was essentially emasculated in favor of Galadriel and Mirian, and yeah, I mean, Elendil was essentially sacrificed on the altar of girl power, so to speak. I mean, Amazon and everyone else in Hollywood, one of their focuses is to make everything much more female-centric. Even if the main character in a story might be a guy, they're still going to change that. So yeah, I mean, Lord of the Rings fans, they had none of this, because Tolkien fans know that this is not Tolkien at all. I mean, Tolkien fans, they are smart. They know their stories very well, and when you decide to screw around with Tolkien's works, they're going to know immediately, and they're going to let you know it. But how did Amazon and people in the press treat Tolkien fans? Well, in the last video I talked about how they had a much more diverse casting, and Tolkien fans, they were saying that, look, this is based on European mythology and folklore, and this was meant as mythology for England. Tolkien specifically stated that, and so it doesn't always make sense to have a more diverse casting to reflect modern day. Doesn't matter. You disagree with their diverse casting, you're an istophobe. And Amazon right here, calling Tolkien fans certain words. You have people in the press who are, in Amazon's back pocket, also calling Tolkien fans certain istophobe words and calling them a vocal minority. I mean, essentially what Amazon's doing and what people in Hollywood are doing is they're taking their diverse casts and they're using them as a shield and a spear. They're weaponizing them. They're using them as a shield against any criticism of their show. And there is a lot to criticize about Rings of Power. And Amazon is also using them as a spear against any critics, as a way to try and silence them. Call them certain names and try and scare them into ever speaking up. That's essentially what Amazon and people in Hollywood and people in the press are doing against critics of this show. And anything else, really, that's coming out these days. They got called a vocal minority. Well, evidently they're not a vocal minority, these critics. And of course, I mean, here I'm on RottenTomatoes.com. The esteemed professional critics, they overwhelmingly like this show that vandalizes Tolkien's work. But actual Tolkien fans themselves, they had none of it. And in all honesty, I mean, this score's probably not even this high. There have been quite a few. I mean, there's been a lot of word about Rotten Tomatoes messing around with the review scores, trying to protect stories and shows. You know, there's word about IMDb also doing the same thing. There's this one video here I have here from Jeremy from The Quartering. That guy is a great channel to follow. But Amazon Prime, one day they, just overnight in the dead of night, they deleted a good 90% of their one-star reviews on Amazon. And I guess they thought no one would notice, but no, Lord of the Rings fans, they're watching everybody like a hawk, and they noticed immediately that Amazon was deleting all the bad reviews. There's also been a bunch of people on Amazon Prime who were leaving bad reviews and saying that Amazon was blocking their reviews. So in other words, Amazon, they've been trying as hard as they possibly could to suppress all the backlash against their vandalization of Tolkien's work. They also did this here once where they had a few quote-unquote super fans gathering together to talk about, I guess, one of the trailers that came out for Lord of the Rings. And I tell you folks, this right here, this was probably the most embarrassing thing that I had ever seen in my life. But all four of these people, they essentially demonstrated that they don't know anything about Tolkien, and they are not the super fans that Amazon is saying that they are. Whenever they talked about the show, they essentially just talked about it has a lot more diversity. It's great that I can see myself on screen, you know, things like that. You know, they recited a bunch of talking points. I mean, this whole thing was completely fake. Now, Amazon, they can try all they want to suppress critics. They can try all they want to silence critics. People in the press can try all they want to convince us that we are just a vocal minority, but at the end of the day, they are not going to be able to shame people into watching their show. Here we have Forbes.com. Rings of Power was a massive flop that most viewers gave up on. And it says down here, a mere 37% of people who started the show actually ended up finishing it. So basically 2/3 of the people who started watching Rings of Power, they didn't bother finishing it because it simply wasn't a good show at all. And by the way, folks, I still haven't gone into everything that took place in the saga that was Amazon's vandalization of Tolkien's work. And you contrast all this with Ian McKellen here saying it's not my job to tell the audience what to think. You contrast this with Peter Jackson saying we didn't want to put any of our messages into Tolkien's work. We just want to honor Tolkien by putting his messages in. I mean, I tell you this, folks, thank God the Lord of the Rings movies were made 20 years ago and not today. If they were made today, they would have been terrible. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, if you consider hitting the like button, hitting the subscribe button, I'd greatly appreciate it. Thank you all very much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Take care until then.